Hey guys, this is Melanie with Swim Against the Current. I am on to talk about a couple of things. I hope you guys got a chance, first of all, to see my interview with Bullet Holes in the Bible that aired on Monday. Since that time, I've had a lot on my mind and I've been going through quite a bit. And so, my idea for today is to talk about some connecting stuff that I've been mentioning in a 4-part series so far on ego. And so, this first part about the ego is a kind of a new concept that I'm learning about. And it's really important as you experience an ego death. I think it's necessary to understand why the ego needs to feel special. And in this process, why the ego is ultimately responsible for what happens to us as we go through an ego death. But keep in mind, an ego death is not necessarily possible. The thought in psychology, the thought in mental health, and the thought in spirituality is that the ego can be controlled. The ego can be kind of monitored and kind of pushed back. And so in spirituality or on a spiritual journey, people are looking for a way to break free of morality and existing challenges and develop their own sense of self. So it's not like you're losing your moral compass. It's not like you're losing your ability to make really good decisions with healthy ego function. And so my point is that in this ego death process, or what we refer to as an ego death, it simply means that you are lessening the chances that the ego has control over you and over your life. And so the narratives that you've developed are decreasing, or they're becoming non-existent, and you're re-emerging as your authentic and true self. In my journey so far, I've noticed some common themes about spiritual health and spiritual destination, enlightenment, or as some might call it, growth. What I've noticed is that there's a quest to completely dissolve the things that we came from, the experiences that we've had, which I think is important in part for ego death and developing ego strength, so that you can function on your own and you know what you're capable of without having to lean on something that you in the past have felt has been very beneficial to you. So like an old belief system or an old way of living. And the reason why I say this is because those experiences make who you are today. And this may sound a little bit contradictory to some of the things that I've said in other videos, but I firmly believe that experiences are valuable, but I want to give some warning as to, in spiritual transition, the need to constantly be valuing yourself through experience. So what I'm trying to say is in my spiritual journey, I have been Buddhist, I've been Christian, I've been everything. I've tried everything. And those experiences led me to who I am today. I'm an agnostic atheist at this point. So what I'm trying to say is don't devalue the things that you have been through, but don't let them define you. And as you go through this ego death, understand that going through this means that you are coming to terms with those experiences. You're coming to peace with that. And so you no longer feel the need to make it a point to live through those experiences, which is what we know to be identity, which also fuels our personality. So to get started with this a little bit, I wanted to share an article from, let's see, Very Well Mind regarding ego strength. So let me see if I can pull this up and share this with you guys. So in this article, we see a couple of key points, and I just want to kind of read through it a little bit so that you can understand what I'm trying to say when I say, which is also the title of this video, that the ego needs to feel special, or it needs to remain special in the process of ego death. And so Sigmund Freud was the first person to postulate or develop a theory called psychoanalytic theory of personality, which he determined there are three types of ego strengths: the id, the superego, and the ego. And so the first part of the article says, in Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory of personality, ego strength is the ability of the ego to deal effectively with the demands of the id, the superego, and reality. Those with little ego strength may feel torn between these competing demands, while with too much ego strength can become too unyielding and rigid. Ego strength helps us maintain emotional stability and cope with internal and external stress. And so let's back up for a second. I recently made a comment about rigidity and two types of polarity with people as they kind of develop their spiritual identity. And so one of the things that we see is that if you are at a low ego strength, or you have difficulty meeting challenges, or you have difficulty with accepting things as they are, or how do I want to put it? Resilience, I think, is a good word to kind of describe this. So if you're struggling to be resilient and to navigate through life, you're probably going to lean towards a more rigid polarity, which oftentimes we find characteristic of religion. And in my experience with this as a Christian, when I was a Christian, I realized that I was really rigid to change. I was really rigid to wanting to develop an identity that was based on anything other than what I believed. And so I was fully invested. And so I could not accept that the world was going through violence, or that there were changes in political structure, or there were changes in the economy and the economy might collapse. And so it was like, at that time, everything caused anxiety for me. And so I became more rigid and kind of went into a state which Freud refers to in this article as, which we'll see in a minute, as a fantasy world or a false reality, because it was easier for me to cope and to meet those challenges through being distracted, if that makes sense. And so the next part of this is the ego strength background. And so what this article says is, also according to the same theory in psychodynamic theory, first created by Freud, personality is composed of three elements: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is made up of all primal urges and desires, and is only part of personality present at birth. And so if you think about it, we see this concept in every single religion, right? This is the concept innately of the flesh. And so this is the concept that we know as our innate desire, our natural state of being, physicality, or the ability to not be capable of experiencing immortality. And so just keep that in mind as we continue to kind of go through this article. So the next point is the superego, which is a part of the personality that is composed of internalized standards and rules that we acquire from our parents and our society. Okay, so we already talked about experiences. So the superego, this is another word for the superego, is experiences. So it's the experiences that we have that influence our moral values and our behaviors and our identity constructs, or how we function. And then finally is the ego. And so our ego kind of puts all of this together, and it fuels our super ego, or our knowledge based on experience, and gives us that fuel to function in the world. However, ego can be positive or negative. So let's talk about how ego can be positive or negative. So what I want to say about ego being negative is that ego that's negative is those really, really, really strong thoughts that influence you to do a certain thing. And so a therapist or someone that has a psychological background or has studied psychology is going to say that those negative thoughts are called like negative self-talk, because you can hear them in your head and you think them, and so they influence you. And so if the ego creates thoughts that are negative, chances are the outcome, which is what most people live for, is going to be negative. However, if those thoughts are positive, then you're going to be motivated towards change. You're going to be motivated towards fluidity. And so you're going to be able to cope better. And when that process happens, that's how you know that the ego is starting to kind of lose control, because the ego has control when the majority of your thinking patterns are negative. And so what I wanted to also touch on in this article, so that this video is not super lengthy, is the next point that is made in a different article by National Institute of Health. Let's see. National Center for Biotechnology Information, sorry, and it's under the National Library of Medicine. And so in this article, we see a lot of different points about how spiritual health is a good thing with regard to helping someone, like I just mentioned a little bit ago, refrain from being anxious or controlled by environmental circumstance. So it's a way to cope with reality. It's a way to cope with how things look and how things are feeling, but it's not exactly something that I would suggest as a complete sense for one's own ego strength. Relying on spiritual practice is a great way to connect. It's a great way to learn about yourself and learn about your strengths and your weaknesses, but it is not a substitute for actually functioning in society. It's not a substitute for moral decision making, age appropriate decision making, or anything like that. So spiritual practice is for connection and being able to understand that, yeah, if you believe that there's a greater, higher deity, being, God, however you want to put this, then fine, you know. So it's a way to connect to that. For a lot of spiritual people like myself, though, it's a way to improve self, and it's a way to understand myself better and what I've been through, and letting go of the things that are very, very like detrimental to me and have influenced me negatively, and kind of take back who I was before I had all of these things imprinted on me, and I was given a sense of who I'm supposed to be through tradition and through religion, and come back to who I was when I was born. So as we just kind of discussed that natural state of being. So I'm going to go ahead and share this second article. So this is an article on mediating the ego. The necessary point is like we just talked about, spirituality helps mediate that ego. So it helps mediate and determine direction based on what you believe, based on what you focus on. And so it serves two purposes. Like I said, there's a connection to a higher power when you are spiritual or religious, if you believe that. And then there's a way to cope with the things that surround you. And so if your strength, your ego strength is low, which means that you have a difficulty dealing with the things that are going on around you, you are more likely to develop a religious narrative. You're more likely to participate in a religious group or have a spiritual leader or make this the sole focus of your life. I often have seen in the mental health field that the more religious and the more spiritual a person is, the less participatory they are in society. So the less they're actually out there, the less that they actually can function, and the less that they desire to function in the world. I've shared my experiences recently on some things that happened to me within the last year where I saw this all too well. And this indicated to me that I'm at a different level in terms of how I function and my ability to function. And it may be because I have a mental health background, that I do work with people that struggle with these things and I'm able to recognize them, that I have mental health training. I do currently hold a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. I'm practicing in the field, and as such, I see a lot of characteristics that are suggestive of low ego functioning or low ego strength. And those include the things that I've talked about, that real reluctance to participate in society. And so when you see that, you can almost kind of want to classify a person as having antisocial personality disorder or being antisocial. And I would say that that's not correct. And so I'm not going to bring in like my mental health background. I just want to share some information on this. But I would say that there are tendencies for a person with low ego strength to develop a mental health diagnosis in the future, or a mental health symptomology or symptoms. And so that could be depression, it could be anxiety, it could be losing touch with reality to the point of experiencing psychosis or psychotic break, which it's been shown, and I'll probably end up putting out another video on this, the link between religious practice, extreme religious practice, and schizophrenia. There's a higher correlation between those two things, because once the mind shifts into that state of adopting a false reality, which is being separate, it is only participating in like religious activities and, you know, biblical study. If you're a Christian, like I used to be, there's a real high correlation in that people will actually develop some type of psychological disorder, mental illness, or the like. And so just keep that in mind. But I wanted to touch on what this article has to say about spiritual health and like physical health. And so to kind of put some of this in perspective in terms of why someone may choose to live according to a religious narrative, we need to look at like some ego strength points. And so I just kind of want to skim read through this article that I found that talks more in depth about and so what we see, and the definition of ego strength is this: ego strength points to a person's view of his problem, his typical reaction to distress, and his adaptive ability in emotional situations. In other words, ego strength indicates effectiveness in regulating motivations and impulses and adjusting to The environment. Ego strength is a variable that can predict adaptability because it represents the extent of ego effectiveness in adapting task with environmental demands. In a healthy mind with a suitable function, there is a consistency among its id, ego, and superego and ego strength that helps in emotional balance maintenance while waiting or working for achieving more improvement. And we mentioned this also earlier. This is introduced in two main characteristics, such as ego strength components that include ego control and ego resistance. So if you guys are interested, I'm going to post more about this article in the description box below. But I wanted to share it backs up those points on the more you are resilient, the more that you can handle problems on your own, the less likely you are to be susceptible to joining a religion, being part of a religion, being part of a religious narrative. And so there are a lot of factors that I've discussed in my videos, and I've talked about this narrative a ton. And so what is a narrative? A narrative is those constructs that form the ego, such as those experiences that have imprinted traditions, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, parts of our personality, that don't come from like biological factors, like from at birth receiving genes from your parents. I'm talking about like personality traits that have been acquired because you've developed them in the environment. And so your environment has dictated to you how to behave and what's acceptable. And so that's what you've done, is you've adapted to that. And so those are ego constructs. Based off of those ego constructs are the thoughts that you're going to hear in your mind, as we've already discussed. But what I want to go into is that you can see that if a person has difficulty with resilience and difficulty with accepting challenges and they're at a low ego strength, they're going to join a group, or they're going to be more susceptible to making that their reality, because that's what they can handle. That's what they can emotionally handle in their emotional intelligence, which makes their emotional intelligence or ability to manage emotions very, very low. So to get back to the title of this video, which is The Ego Needs to Feel Special. Why did I title this video, The Ego Needs to Feel Special? I titled this video, The Ego Needs to Feel Special, because it's something that came to my mind yesterday, and I started to think about my entire journey spiritually to this point. And what I came up with was, and I heard myself say, not my ego say, is the ego needs to feel special. And so the ego needs to feel set apart. It needs to feel right. It needs to feel like it's influencing your actions, because it's your internal voice. It's your, it's part of your ability to make decisions. Let's call it that. It needs to feel special in that it needs to be the thing that is in control the most. And so as you experience an ego death, this voice gets louder. It gets louder and louder and louder and louder, and it can bring on old things that you may have forgotten about that cause you to become angry with yourself, or fear things that you haven't feared in a while, or feel shame about your appearance. And you really aren't any of those things. And there could be other things as well, but they're coming up for you because that ego needs to feel special. It needs to feel set apart from the rest of you. It needs to be the bigger thing. And so as you're learning to control it, as you're learning to kind of shut it off and let go of these parts of this ego that you have, you let go of layers, that gets less and less and less. And so it starts to decrease. And so for me, what I have been noticing is that the more I push against it, the more resistance I get, which I covered in my last video. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's part 4 of my ego series called Resistance. And that's that resistance is you're making this smaller. You're taking notice of the things that construct your ego. And what I mean by you are is your soul. And so you're pushing against what you have been taught and what you think is right. And you're redetermining your direction. And so as you redetermine your direction and you choose a different path, you choose a path that's authentic, that's not influenced by the things that you've been through, while keeping your experiences in mind, that ego is going to need to feel special. That ego is going to get larger. It's going to influence negatively to keep you from doing this, because once that gets smaller, you're able to take control of the person that you originally were. So with this being said, I know that there's a lot of information in this video, but I want to close it on a personal note and just say, for me, I realized that in my spiritual journey, I started out as someone who was not capable and became anxious with the world. I was not capable of dealing with being an adult. I was not capable of responsibility. I was not capable of wanting to function. And because of this, because I struggled with it, and I think some of that came from my upbringing and arguing with my parents about money early on and not really taking it seriously, I developed a very, very standoffish viewpoint of the world. I thought that everything was horrible, everything was evil, that people were, motivated to do harm towards me. And there were a ton of other things that, like, my ego was telling me. And I was living through my experience. So that's what my identity was shaped on. And this was up until about a year ago. I was living like this, and I had gotten so invested in Christianity, and then I left Christianity and I joined Torah observance, and then from Torah observance I went into a really small group of friends that was more concerned about, like, the fundamental principles of Christianity, and not acknowledging the flesh, not acknowledging sin, not sinning, very condemning group. And so it just increased that largeness of my ego and the negative thinking that I have always had from the experiences that I've had while religious. And so my point is that during that time, that's all I could hear. And so I stopped functioning in a higher level of ego strength, which allowed me to kind of critically think and determine my own path like I'm doing now. And so as I determine my own path like I'm doing now, that becomes less and less, if that gives you guys an example of what I'm trying to say. The more you are able to examine what you believe, who you are, do your own research, the more you're going to be able to live a freer life. And I would say at this point, despite going through a lot of struggles this last year, I do feel freer. And I also am noticing that the ego is getting smaller and smaller. And so that for me is how I know that progress is occurring. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I always enjoy sharing with you as I keep walking on my spiritual journey, and it's not like anybody else's. And so if you have questions, please reach out and ask. I've given my email to subscribers. Also, like and subscribe to hear more content, and also like so I know what you think is important and what you would like to hear more about or learn more about. I'm open to sharing, and I'm open to helping you guys as you move forward. All right, I'll see you on the next one. Take care.